Did you ever get blamed for something you didn't do, just because you were easy to blame?
They said it so casually, as if they were talking about taking out the trash or asking me to water the plants. You should stay home and work hard. That's what's best for you. Those were the last words my mother tossed over her shoulder before slamming the trunk of the SUV, her face hidden behind sunglasses, her mouth curved in a smile that wasn't meant for me. My dad was already behind the wheel, honking impatiently while my brother carried his cooler of beer like it was some kind of royal treasure. My sister adjusted her oversized sun hat, snapped a selfie, and waved with the kind of smirk that wasn't really a goodbye but more of a look at me, look at what you'll never have. And just like that, they all drove away toward the beach resort they had apparently been planning for weeks, the one I only learned about when I asked why they were suddenly dragging 3 suitcases down the hall. I stood in the doorway of our house, barefoot, with the cheap welcome mat scratching at my toes, and felt the heat of betrayal press against my chest harder than the summer sun overhead. It wasn't just about the vacation, though God knows it would have been nice to sit by the water for once, drinking something cold and letting the wind touch my face. It was about the way they excluded me so cleanly, so deliberately, as if my absence would make their fun easier, lighter, somehow more complete. My dad had even joked the night before that I could hold down the fort and finally put that hard-working attitude to use. The truth was, I never had a choice in the matter. I was the fort, the one expected to stay, to sacrifice, to be invisible when the family spotlight turned warm and golden for everyone else. I walked back inside the empty house, the sound of their laughter still buzzing in my ears even though the car had turned the corner long ago. Every photo on the wall screamed the same message: family unity, togetherness, joy, except, when you looked closer, I was always on the edge of the frame, a shoulder, half a face, or sometimes missing entirely. I poured myself a cup of stale coffee, stared at the peeling paint on the kitchen cabinets, and thought about how neatly they had written me out of their weekend like an unwanted footnote in the family history. At first, I told myself I would treat it like any other weekend. I would clean, pay the bills, maybe do some laundry, maybe watch the shows nobody else cared for. But the silence of the house grew thick, pressing against my skin until even the ticking clock felt like a personal insult. I walked from room to room, opening drawers, touching things they had left behind, and with each touch I felt something unraveling inside me. In my brother's room, a half-packed duffel bag smelled of sunscreen and cologne, while in my sister's room, the dresser overflowed with new clothes bought for the trip. My parents' bedroom was neat, locked in that stiff perfection they prided themselves on, the bed made tightly enough to bounce a coin, their bags gone. I realized in that moment that my role was not daughter or sister, but unpaid caretaker of their space, their memories, their comfort. The longer I stood there, the more I started to laugh, not loudly, but in that quiet, bitter way you laugh when a truth you've always known finally announces itself. They wanted me to stay home and work hard? Fine. I'd stay home. But I wasn't going to sit here crying into a pillow or scrolling through pictures of their resort cocktails and group selfies. If they thought my absence would make life easier, then maybe it was time to give them exactly what they asked for, an absence they could choke on. That thought clung to me like a secret lover all afternoon. I cooked myself dinner and ate it slowly, letting the idea sharpen itself in my mind. Revenge wasn't about screaming or breaking things, it was about silence, precision, and timing. They had left me behind as if my existence were optional, and I realized I had the power to show them what life truly looked like without me. I wasn't going to confront them, beg them, or wait for their half-hearted souvenirs. No. My plan would be quieter, more deliberate, and far more unsettling than any argument at the dinner table could ever be. By the time the sun dipped low and painted the living room with that heavy golden light, I already knew my path. I looked at the photos on the wall again, the smiling faces, the laughter frozen forever, and I whispered to myself, "You wanted me invisible? Then invisible you shall have." I poured the last of my coffee down the sink, washed the cup carefully, dried it, and placed it back in the cabinet as though nothing had happened. When I climbed into bed that night, I wasn't sad anymore. I wasn't lonely either. I felt something sharper, colder, a clarity I hadn't tasted in years. They were off clinking glasses on the beach, convinced they had left me trapped in the shadows of this house. But shadows can stretch, and shadows can swallow whole. And as I closed my eyes, I couldn't help but smile at the thought that when they returned, the house they walked back into would not be the same one they had left behind. Morning arrived with a varnished stillness that made the whole house feel staged, as if someone had rented our life by the hour and cleared out the actors for a lunch break, and I moved through it barefoot with a mug of black coffee that tasted like burnt apologies, counting the small humiliations that had become my routine while everyone else was posting sunrise photos from the boardwalk, because that was how my mind worked when I got hurt. I made lists, I drew maps, and then I followed them, with the stubborn precision of someone who has finally stopped asking for permission. I started in the hallway where the family photos lined the wall like a curated museum of selective memory, and I noticed the way my mother's hand always rested on my sister's shoulder, the way my dad leaned toward my brother, the way I hovered near door frames or stood half-turned as if I had wandered in from another household and forgot to leave, which would have been funny if it weren't such an efficient summary of the last decade. So I took a breath, lifted each frame, pulled the backs, and slid out the prints one by one, laying them on the carpet like a brittle deck of cards, and I began, with a little laugh I could not stop, to separate the images into piles. Keep, duplicate, replace, erase. I did not tear anything. I am not a destroyer by nature. I am a revisionist with neat handwriting, and instead I cut myself out with a craft blade I found in my brother's desk, clean slices around the ghost of my arm or the tip of my shoe, until all that remained were the four of them arranged in their preferred constellation while my scraps gathered on the edge of the coffee table like shed skin, and then I went to the local print shop's website, uploaded copies, and ordered replacements that cropped tighter, brighter, more flattering, as if the official record had always meant to look this way, as if I had never existed. In the meantime, I opened our shared cloud albums on my laptop and scrolled through years of uploads where my presence felt like a typo that fooled autocorrect, and I began to untag myself from every face recognition grouping, to remove my name from the search metadata, and to move folders out of the shared library and into a private archive that I encrypted and labeled with the least interesting word I could think of, something like manuals, because nothing keeps nosy people away like the promise of boredom. By the time the printer confirmed my order number and gave me a cheerful estimate for pickup, I had already worked my way to the bedroom and pulled down the storage bins that held the life I financed in pieces, because here is something parents of the "you should work hard" school seldom admit out loud. The hardworking child often buys the things that make everyone else comfortable, so I inventoried what I had paid for with my own overtimed weekends: the coffee machine with the stainless reservoir, the router that actually reached the back porch, the weighted blanket my mother swore cured her insomnia, the cast-iron skillet that turned my father into a Sunday chef. And I made quiet replacements with thrift store equivalents I had been collecting for months, without even admitting to myself why. Sliding in a sputtering drip brewer and a wheezing single-band router and a blanket that shed lint like dandelion fluff and a non-stick pan with a bowed bottom that would hiss at high heat. Nothing was broken, nothing was stolen, everything functioned in a way that could not be blamed on me, and yet the house took one step closer to the kind of minor, persistent discomfort they had assigned me for years, and I cannot pretend it didn't feel like justice measured in teaspoons. I synchronized the address changes I had prepared the night before in a fit of insomnia and stubbornness, forwarding the mail with my name to a box across town I had rented under an alias that was close enough to my own to avoid suspicion. And I closed the streaming profiles I paid for with the quiet confidence of a woman canceling a membership that never fit, leaving the television logged into a free trial that would expire the day they returned, which, yes, is petty, but there is a particular dignity in recovering the cost of your own kindness when no one else will even say thank you. I backed up my documents, exported my tax files, and vacuumed under my bed where forgotten socks and receipts formed a paper trail of neglected celebrations, and then I packed. I did not pack like someone running away. I packed like someone cleaning a room for a new tenant, labeling boxes with tidy nouns and wrapping my framed certificates in brown paper, because there is power in the calm choreography of departure when no one expects you to go. Around noon, I drove to the print shop, picked up the recropped family, and slid them into the frames at the curb with the windows rolled down, and by the time I rehung the hallway, the house looked exactly the same to a casual eye, only more correct, as if a professional had come through and improved the composition, which made me laugh again, quietly and a little viciously, because I had finally understood the language they spoke, and I could speak it better. In the late afternoon, I opened my mother's tablet, logged into the family calendar she never bothered to restrict, and moved my name off every recurring task I had been doing since forever: pharmacy pickups, vet visits, bill reminders, shifting each one neatly to unassigned, which is a funny, polite term for "you'll notice me when it hurts," and then, because I promised myself to keep my revenge thoughtful rather than loud, I scheduled a single delivery for the day before they returned. A housekeeping service paid with a prepaid card in my desk and instructed to dust, vacuum, and polish everything except one locked bedroom that would be empty by then, so the house would be spotless and wrong at the same time. As dusk slipped over the roofline, I walked one last circuit and left one thing behind that did not belong there at all: a slim brass key in a clear envelope taped to the underside of the dining table with a note that said "Only storage." Because every good magic trick needs a misdirection, and if they wanted me invisible, then the object they found first should be the one that sends them searching in the exact, exquisitely wrong direction. And while that small invention was hardly a confession, the real revenge had already bloomed, somewhere between the blank calendar, the swapped frames, the thrifted utilities, and the quiet subtraction of every convenience I had bankrolled. I had returned the house to the four of them exactly as they preferred it. Perfectly curated, tightly cropped, and entirely without me, which felt so sharp and satisfying that when I finally locked my empty room and slid the key onto my ring, I understood that the next step would not be anger at all but a disappearance rehearsed with a smile, and the only question left was how far I could push the performance before they realized the show had already started. I woke to the kind of restless excitement that feels suspiciously like peace, the steady certainty that the plan had passed the point of being a fantasy scratched on the back of a receipt and had become a living thing with its own breath and pulse. And I moved through the morning with deliberate slowness, because good vanishing acts never look rushed. They look inevitable, like a tide that has been gathering offshore for hours and only now reaches the rocks with a sound that says, "Of course this is happening, of course this was always the shoreline's fate." I started with the phone, not the dramatic part with numbers and new carriers that people imagine when they picture reinvention, but the boring foundation that actually makes a person disappear. I exported my contacts to a plain text file, printed a hard copy for myself, and then pruned the tree with tidy, almost affectionate care, removing the family thread from favorites, archiving every chat that had me playing tech support or therapist, and setting a silent filter that would deliver any message containing words like help, login, or password directly into a folder labeled later, because if they wanted my labor without my presence, they could keep the echo of it, delayed, distant, and useless. I created a new email that sounded like a sleep aid brand, moved my banking alerts there, and set a rule that auto-responded to any message from my mother with a cheerful lie about being on a work sprint and turning off notifications, which was not an alibi so much as an anesthetic, dulling sensation, buying time, ensuring that when the house woke up to the missing organ it would be too numb to diagnose the injury. The storage unit key under the table had not been a bluff, which is to say there was indeed a unit, and there was indeed a lock that key would open, but the room it guarded was designed not to reveal me, but to waste them, a measured insult disguised as an answer. Because when you have spent years being the responsible one, you learn the exact weight of other people's impatience, so I rented 2 spaces at opposite ends of the facility, one for me and one for them, and in the decoy unit I arranged the kind of breadcrumb trail any overconfident parent thinks they deserve: a stack of labeled boxes with dates that implied a hurried move, a plastic tub of childhood yearbooks from which I had carefully removed every instance of my first and last name with a scalpel and a scanner, and a single cardboard file marked lease that contained an expired sublet agreement for a town 2 hours away, helpfully highlighted and entirely worthless. In my real unit, Further down the echoing hallway I stored the true cargo of my life, the certificates and notebooks I refused to abandon, a small fireproof safe with the originals of documents that had defined me, and a suitcase with enough clothing to start over without looking like I had fled. Because there is a dignity in continuity even when you are writing a discontinuity other people will choke on. Neighbors require choreography, so I did what I had always done, smiled, waved, and offered small practical gifts that made people like me for very specific reasons. Only this time I wrote a script for them without their knowledge. Stopping by Mrs. Cunningham's porch with a bag of pet treats and an enthusiastic promise that I would be out of town for a training week, while a friend came by to water the fern and collect packages, which ensured that any unusual movement at my door would scan as helpful rather than suspicious. Then I texted my friend Janelle, the one person who never asked me to shrink in order to fit in her calendar squares, and told her I was taking that long overdue break we joked about after each of my family's small humiliations, and while I did not share the specifics, I asked if I could crash at her place for a few nights with an armload of files and a strange idea about turning absence into evidence, to which she replied, as she always did, "Come as you are, bring wine," and that was enough to relax the last muscle clenched between my shoulders. Digital housekeeping came next, not the theatrical deletion of accounts, but the quieter, more poisonous work of sanding off edges until fingers slip. I changed the answers to security questions on the family cable and utilities portals, replacing favorite teacher and first pet with phrases only I would ever think to try, like the name of a vending machine brand we passed on a terrible road trip, and I toggled the home thermostat schedule to the eco setting that would leave the house just uncomfortable enough to attract complaints without triggering concern. Then I paused automatic grocery deliveries that had become invisible to everyone but me, letting the kitchen run slightly bare so that the first night back would feel inexplicably hollow, flavorless, and small. I did not break anything. I did not steal a cent, but I removed the grease that made the machine purr, and if that sounds petty, it is only because you have never been assigned the role of grease and told you should be proud of the shine on someone else's car. In the afternoon, I drove the long way to the bank, opened a small checking account in my new no-nonsense name, and queued an automatic transfer from my primary account set to trigger the morning of their return. Not because I feared a fight over money, but because I wanted the clean line drawn, the beautiful barrier of separate ledgers that would keep me from the old reflex of solving everything with my debit card. On the way home, I stopped at a discount store for a prepaid phone with an ugly ringtone and spent 10 quiet minutes porting my number to a fresh SIM while the cashier asked if I was switching for a promotion, which made me smile, because yes, in a way, I was finally promoting myself out of the entry-level position my family had kept me in since forever. Back at the house, I loaded my remaining boxes into the trunk, carried my suitcase down the stairs, and did the small last inspection every woman does when leaving a place she has kept running, checking windows, cleaning the lint trap, wiping the mirror of fingerprints, acts of care so automatic they almost felt like betrayal now that I had decided care would no longer be my brand. For the day's revenge, because I promised myself that each step deserved its own sting, I left a single postcard on the kitchen counter addressed to the house rather than to any of their names, a vintage view of a beach they were visiting, with neat block letters that said, "Wish you were here," and nothing else, which would register as a prank to anyone who did not know the texture of our family. But to my mother it would feel like a dare, to my father it would feel like a puzzle missing a corner piece, and to my siblings it would feel like the first cold draft under a locked door. I locked the front door from the inside, stepped out through the garage like a stagehand leaving behind a perfect set, and as I drove toward Janelle's place with the evening sun turning the road into a ribbon of brass, I felt the cliff begin to form under their feet, the slight crumble that comes when you realize the person you considered furniture has wheels. And while I did not yet know whether my ending would be clean or haunted, I knew that when they returned to the museum of themselves and found me gone, the plaque beneath the family portrait would suddenly read in a language they had never learned, and it would say simply, "Exhibit closed. Interpret at your own risk." They returned on a late evening that smelled like airport air and coconut lotion. the kind of tired triumph people carry when they believe they have escaped consequence by buying a few days of sun. And I sat in Janelle's quiet living room with my feet tucked under me and the borrowed cat, deciding whether my lap was trustworthy. Watching the scene unfold through a slow drip of notifications and the small theater of shared devices that had never needed two-factor because no one thought the furniture would move, and the first sign was my mother's tablet coming online with a sleepy pulse while the housekeeping service marked their job complete with 4 photos that did not understand what they had captured, a hallway gleaming like a model home, a living room whose surfaces held nothing but coasters, and the family wall where the frames now displayed a more flattering truth that excluded me so neatly it could have been a professional correction. They came through the door with rolling suitcases and clattered flip-flops and the friendly argument of who left the sunscreen in the car, and then you could feel it, even from a distance, the curious hush that hits when the orchestra misses a note and everyone at the table pretends not to notice. Because the house was not wrong, not exactly, yet it resisted their weight in ways they could not immediately name, the air a few degrees off, the couch pillows aligned with hotel crispness, the kitchen counter too bare for a home that had breath only 3 days ago, and my postcard sitting in the center like a conversation starter from a host who never arrived. I did not need a camera to know how my mother picked up the card by its edges the way she handles unfamiliar books, how my father made a dad joke that landed on tile, how my sister laughed and then did not laugh because laughter requires confirmation and there was none, how my brother opened the fridge with the confidence of someone returning to his personal fueling station and then stared at the resigned bottle of mustard as if a grocery delivery could betray a family, and even before the words, "Where did she put the streaming passwords?" formed in the room like a cloud you could taste, my little timer tripped and the profile logged itself out. The free trial ending with a polite message that offered a discount while my father pressed buttons with the impatience of a man who has never been told no by a remote control. Upstairs the thermostat ticked back to eco and downstairs the router sighed like a tired appliance that had lost its enthusiasm for reaching every corner, and when my mother finally went down the hall to call me with that tone she uses for reliable house elves, she paused in front of the photographs and bit down on a question. Because she could not accuse a wall of lying, and yet the wall had clearly decided that 5 faces were too many for a pleasing composition, and if she was about to insist that I had been in that picture from the 4th of July, where my brother held a sparkler like an unearned trophy, the frame would have offered its corrected version, without consulting her memory. I had placed the brass key at knee height to favor discovery by someone tidying up, and the housekeeping team, bless their professionalism, left it untouched. So when my sister crawled under the table to retrieve her tumbling sunglasses, she found the envelope and shrieked like a child who just discovered a secret she wasn't meant to know, and the chorus began. What storage? Whose key? Did she move out? Did she tell you? Why didn't she tell me? Has anyone checked her room? And then came the reveal that should not have surprised them but did, an immaculate bedroom stripped to the dignity of a guest space, the closets reading as a concept rather than a life. The nightstand empty except for the housekeeper's folded card and a lavender sachet that I left on purpose, because it carried the kind of scent that makes panic feel civilized. And when my mother opened my dresser and found nothing but 2 neatly rolled pairs of socks that did not match and a single hair tie like a punctuation mark, something in her voice changed from annoyance to premonition, which is a sound children learn to recognize and decide whether to respect or weaponize. The key worked, of course, and the decoy unit did exactly what I built it to do, which was to tell a compelling lie with the sincerity of a receipt. Because they drove there in a cranky convoy with my brother narrating the obvious and my father trying to be decisive like a man who can fix a mood with a socket wrench. And they stood in the fluorescent hush of rented storage while my mother sifted the breadcrumbs I had baked for her, the labeled boxes that meant nothing, the yearbooks that offered every class, but somehow misplaced every caption that held my name, the expired sublet that said go here and find no one, and if you think that is cruel then you have not measured your worth against your family's willingness to say you are worth gas money. Because I wanted them suspended at the exact height of their consideration for me, upside down and blinking, unsure whether to call it a prank or an indictment. Back at Janelle's, I poured tea that tasted like rain and set the phone face down. Because I did not want to read the messages as much as I wanted to feel them arrive, the way thunder rolls through your ribs before you hear it, and then, when it had been quiet just long enough for dread to concentrate, I sent a single text from the ugly prepaid number to my mother, the sentence simple and careful like a surgeon's first cut, asking how the resort was and whether the ocean sounded different without me. For the day's revenge, which had to be clever rather than loud, because loud teaches people to brace and clever teaches them to look inward. I triggered the calendar routine that returned every task to its rightful owner with tidy push notifications that chimed in cascading order: pharmacy pickup to my father's phone, vet call to my sisters, overdue bill reminder to my brothers. Each alert accompanied by the gentle note reassigned by system, which was true and not true in the most satisfying way, and while they were squinting at their screens in that peculiar modern panic that confuses responsibility with malfunction, the landline rang with the cheerful voice of the housekeeping manager asking if the service had met expectations and whether they would like to schedule weekly visits now that the house had reset, and my mother, who prides herself on being a queen of order, said she would call back, only to realize she did not know what number to give because the contact labeled daughter had become a quiet blank. And, because every cliff needs a wind to push from behind, I let the night settle before pressing one last key, sending a link to my father's email from a disposable address with a subject line that borrowed his own guidance: work hard, and a body that held a single photograph not of me, not of any of us, but of the freshly rehung hallway where 4 people smiled as if the composition had been born that way, and in the reflection on the glass, if you zoomed where no one ever thinks to zoom, there was the faintest ghost of a 5th figure passing by with a box in her arms, a blur that could be light or movement or a trick of cleaning spray, and as he stared and leaned and stared again, I turned off my phone and whispered to the room that tomorrow I would stop being careful and start being specific, because they had finally arrived at the one question that mattered and had no safe answer: if a daughter vanishes without a trace, what exactly vanishes from the people who told her to stay home and work hard? Morning broke with the flat gray honesty of a weekday after a holiday, the kind of light that makes even victories look like paperwork. And I stood at Janelle's kitchen counter stirring oatmeal that tasted like childhood and hospital cafeterias, while I rehearsed the conversation I might allow and the truths I would keep folded like notes in a high school locker. Because the point was never to scream the indictment across a table, but to tune the room until they finally heard the faint frequency I had been living on for years, that thin constant whine of being useful without being seen. And when my phone woke up after a night in the drawer, it delivered a neat stack of messages shaped like the stages of grief that people with good health insurance describe to therapists, starting with my sister's forced cheer that asked whether I had done a little redecorating, and ending with my father's sentence fragments, those clipped commands that pretend to be concern, and between them lay my mother's paragraphs that swung from irritation to a tone that almost sounded like prayer, which would have been moving if the prayer had landed anywhere near me. I let them wait through breakfast, through a slow walk around the block with Janelle's cat supervising from the window like a suspicious landlord, and then I chose the most practical of the phone numbers because practical has always been our family's dialect. And when my mother answered on the second ring with my name stretched into a plea, I could feel the house sucking in air behind her, a living room listening hard, a hallway holding its breath, while I spoke in the even voice I use with customer service when I intend to be the last problem on their shift. I told her I was safe, and she said thank God in a way that told me safety had never been the category she put me in. Then she asked why the house felt wrong, and I said it felt like the house they wanted, a place that did not require me to keep it alive. A place trimmed of accidents and edges, and the person who always remembered where the batteries lived. And when she insisted that this had gone too far, I let myself laugh once, a single clean line that cut through the performance and left the stage open for the real act, because this final movement was not about convincing them to love me with a better vocabulary, but about revealing how ordinary their neglect had been. How perfectly American in its self-mythology of hustle and its distrust of rest, how much it relied on the daughter who stayed behind to keep everyone else feeling modern and free. I told her the key opened a decoy because I wanted them to work, to sweat, to circle the block of their own entitlement, and she said that was cruel, and I agreed. And then I asked whether she had ever considered that telling your child to stay home and work hard while you drive to the ocean with the rest of the family might register as cruel in any language, at any income, in any decade since the invention of cars and guilt, and for a long moment that felt like a country mile, she said nothing at all. It would have been easy to end there with an itemized bill of grievances and a hang-up fit for a courtroom drama, but commentary ages faster than silence, so I chose the quieter revenge I had prepared. The one that walked through the front door politely and sat on the coffee table like a guest who brought dessert, and I told her I had scheduled a videographer to arrive that afternoon with a scanner and a portable printer. A nice young woman who would cheerfully help them reconstruct the family album from scratch using the photos they believed they remembered, and that the service came with a delightful feature my mother would adore called narrative tagging, in which each person in the room says what was happening in the picture, where they were standing, who took it, what jokes were told, and that the software could cross-reference their stories for consistency, producing a tidy report of alignment and error, which would, in the most generous reading, teach them what a memory looks like when the glue has been office tape rather than resin. My mother tried to object on privacy grounds, and I reminded her that she had spent years crowding me out of frames while tagging near strangers at barbecues, and that if this felt invasive, perhaps she could think of it as the feeling I learned the year I realized the photos never used my good side, because my good side was apparently the far edge of the composition. I promised them one last mercy that sounded like a threat only if you have ever been casual with another person's dignity, and I laid it out with the same clarity I use when I write guidelines at work, because rules help people who are bad at kindness. I would return to the house for one evening and one evening only, no later than the end of the week, and they could ask any question they wanted as long as they could avoid the phrase, "But you know we love you," since love is not a metric you get to self-report while the system crashes, and in exchange they would keep every object exactly as it had been when they walked in from the airport. Not a frame adjusted, not a thermostat changed, not a router troubleshot. So that I could see whether they were capable of sitting inside the shape of their own choices without rearranging the furniture to claim a moral victory. My mother said yes so quickly the word tripped, and I believed her because she is very good at keeping things immaculate. When guests are coming, and after I ended the call I told Janelle that I would need the car that evening, that the closing scene of this little experiment required me to walk into my family's museum of sensations and listen for their first honest sentence. Not because I needed it to survive, but because good endings deserve witnesses. Night arrived like a lake the wind forgot, and the house glowed in that suburban way that makes all tragedies look solvable with better lighting, and they were waiting in the living room with glasses of water held like props. And for a long time we spoke like coworkers at an offsite who have decided to risk being real, passing through the ledger of wrongs and misunderstandings without theatrics, until my father, who had been quiet enough to startle me, asked whether I had done something to the pictures or whether the pictures had finally done something to us, and I felt the ending slide into place with the neatness of a drawer that has been stuck for years. Because that was the only question that mattered, and it did not have an answer you could hold without burning your palms. I told them the truth I could live with, which is that I removed the visible evidence of my effort and left behind the consequence of my absence, that I tuned the house so their ears could catch the pitch of what I had carried, that if the photographs no longer showed me it was because I had learned to stop standing where the camera could convert me into proof without offering me presents, and as I said it the lights flickered once in a way that made my sister shiver. Though it might have been the thermostat cycle, or the router's last exhale, or the ordinary physics of a home whose load had finally shifted. When I left, very late and very steady, I did not take a single thing, not even the lavender sachet that would remind someone to breathe, and as I closed the door I heard my mother ask my father whether the hallway had always held only 4 faces, and he said he could not say for certain without looking at the originals, and she said there were no originals, and he said then maybe this was how it had always been, and I kept walking because that uncertainty was the only inheritance I was willing to leave, a living question that would sit in their house and hum, inviting interpretation, punishing certainty and rewarding effort, and if you ask me where I went after that, I will say only that I chose a place where the ocean sounds different because it arrives for everyone and refuses to choose favorites, and that sometimes, when I hold my phone to the wind and let the noise ride the line, I imagine the old living room hearing it and not knowing whether it is a storm warning or a lullaby, or the plain old sound of work finally leaving the building, which is not an answer so much as a permission slip for anyone who has ever been told to stay home and work hard to decide whether disappearing is an act of cruelty or the smallest possible measure of self-respect.